Good evening, Mr. Evans here. Tonight's story is The Ghost of Windy Hill by Clyde Robert Bulla, and it was originally published in 1968. Some of your parents may be familiar with books that were called the Weekly Reader books, and this is one of those. Chapter 1 is called Evening Visitors. The boy and girl sat on the step in front of the candle shop. They had been waiting for a breeze, but no breeze had come. Daylight was nearly gone. "We'd better go in," said the boy. "Let's wait till they call us," said the girl. "It's so hot up in those little rooms." "It's hot here too," he said, "and we told them we wouldn't stay out after dark." "Can't we stay a little longer?" she asked. "Just till the carriage goes by?" In the distance they could hear the clatter of wheels and horses' hoofs on the cobblestone street. They waited and watched. The carriage came in sight. It was tall and black, and it moved slowly toward them. A man sat high in the driver's seat. Another man was inside, leaning out the window. He called to them, "You there." The boy stood up. "Yes, sir," he said. "Does Professor Carver live on this street?" asked the man. "He lives here," said the boy. The man looked surprised. "In the candle shop?" "He rents the rooms over the shop," said the boy. The carriage stopped. The man got out. "We found it," he said. "This is the place." There was a woman in the carriage. "I tell you, we shouldn't have come," she said. "Of course we should, my dear." The man asked the boy and girl, "Do you know the professor? Could you take us to him?" "Yes, sir," said the boy. "Professor Carver is our father." "Well, well," said the man. "Would you go and say to him that Mr. Giddings is here?" The boy and girl ran upstairs. A woman was there in the doorway. "Mother, it's Mr. Giddings," said the boy. "He wants to see father," said the girl. The woman turned toward the man in the little room behind her. He was sitting under the light, painting a picture. She asked him, "Do you know a Mr. Giddings?" "I don't think so," said Professor Carver. "No, wait. Is he short and stout? Does he have small eyes and bushy eyebrows?" "Yes," said the boy and girl together. "It's all right," said Professor Carver. "I'll see him." Mr. Giddings was already on the stairs. He was leading the woman. She tried to draw back. "I'm not going in there," she said. "Of course you are, my dear." He led her up to the door. "Good evening," he said. "My name is Giddings, and this is my wife." "Good evening," said Professor Carver. "This is my wife, and these are our children, Jamie and Lorna. Come in." They all sat down. "Perhaps you don't remember me," said Mr. Giddings. "I remember you," said Professor Carver. "You came to the school one day." "But there was no chance to talk with you there." Mr. Giddings looked at Jamie and Lorna. "What I have to say may seem strange. If you wish to send the children away—" "I have no secrets from them," said Professor Carver. "Lorna is 10 and Jamie is almost 12. I believe they are old enough to hear whatever you have to say." "Very well," said Mr. Giddings. "Professor Carver, I've first heard of you from my cousin. She comes into Boston every week to study painting in your class. She told me something about you, something I found most interesting." "Yes," Professor Carver said. "She told me," said Mr. Giddings, "that you once lived in a haunted house." Professor Carver sat straight in his chair. "Is it true," asked Mr. Giddings, "that you lived in the house and drove out the ghost that was there?" "How can you ask such a question?" said Professor Carver. "I was told," began Mr. Giddings. We are not living in the Dark Ages, said Professor Carver. We are living today in the year of our Lord 1851. I was told, Mr. Giddings began again. I think I know what you were told, said Professor Carver. A few years ago I had a friend who believed his house was haunted. I laughed at the idea. He dared me to live in the house for a while. To prove how foolish he was, I moved into the house with my wife and children. Your wife and children, too? Said Mr. Giddings. Certainly, said Professor Carver. They are no more afraid of ghosts than I am. We lived there a month. By that time, my friend was ready to believe that he had no ghost in his house. Is this what you heard? Not quite, said Mr. Giddings. I was told that you lived in the haunted house, and because you weren't afraid, you drove the ghost away. Nonsense, said Professor Carver. Some people might not call it nonsense, said Mr. Giddings. Let me tell you why I came to you. I am waiting to hear, said Professor Carver. When I was a boy, I lived near a farm called Windy Hill, said Mr. Giddings. It was the dream of my life to own that farm, even though I was poor, and the dream seemed far away. But life was good to me. Last year, I was able to buy the farm. My wife and I went to live there. And then, he turned to his wife. Tell him, dear. Mrs. Giddings said in a choked voice, The house is haunted. Why do you say that? Asked Professor Carver. Because she was trembling. She put her hands over her face. It's hard for her to talk about it, said Mr. Giddings. She felt odd all the time we were there. Even when she was alone, she could feel eyes watching her. Once she saw something white go floating past the door. Isn't that right, dear? Yes, yes, she said, with her hands still over her face. I love Windy Hill, said Mr. Giddings, but a man can't have his wife frightened out of her wits. We came back to Boston. Then I heard about you, and I thought you might help me. How? Asked Professor Carver. I thought you might live in my house as you lived in the other one, said Mr. Giddings. I thought you might drive out the ghost, if there is a ghost, of course. No, Mr. Giddings, said Professor Carver. The whole idea is foolish. Mrs. Giddings got to her feet. You heard what he said. Now take me home. She and her husband went out together. She said as they went down the stairs, I told you we shouldn't have come here. Chapter 2 is called Mr. Giddings. The next evening, Jamie and Lorna were back in front of the candle shop. The air was still heavy and hot. They were still waiting for a breeze. They heard the sound of carriage wheels. Maybe it's Mr. Giddings coming back, said Lorna. There's not much chance of that, said Jamie. Father said no. I was sorry for Mr. Giddings, said Lorna. So was I, said Jamie. All those years he'd wanted that farm. Then when he got it, he couldn't live there. I like the name Windy Hill, she said. Shut your eyes, Jamie. Now think of Windy Hill and tell me what you see. I see a big house on a high hill, he said, where the wind comes in from the sea. And it's night, and there are trees all around, she said. There's tall grass in the yard. An old man is creeping through the grass. We'd better stop this game, said Jamie. You'll be scaring yourself. No, I won't, she said. Remember the summer when Grandmother told us the stories about witches, he said. Afterward, you walked in your sleep. Father said it was because you were upset. That was a long time ago. I wouldn't be upset now, said Lorna. It's fun to pretend. Let's pretend some more about Windy Hill. Lorna, look, said Jamie. The carriage had come into sight. Jamie, I was right. Excuse me, Lorna said. The carriage stopped and Mr. Giddings got out. He was alone except for the driver. "Good evening," he said. "Is your father at home?" "Yes, sir," said Jamie. "Would he see me again, do you think?" asked Mr. Giddings. "I'll go and ask," said Jamie. "Mr. Giddings is here," said Jamie. "He wants to see father," said Lorna. "What is it now?" asked Professor Carver. "Does he have another ghost story to tell us?" "He looked so sad," said Mrs. Carver. "I wish you'd see what he wants." "Oh, very well," said Professor Carver. Jamie led Mr. Giddings up the stairs. They all sat in the little parlor. "My wife didn't want me to come back," said Mr. Giddings, "but I felt I had to see you again. If you could help me." "How?" asked Professor Carver. "I can't drive a ghost out of a house when there's no ghost there." "I know you don't believe in ghosts," said Mr. Giddings, "and you may be right. But if you went there and lived in the house—" "Why?" asked Professor Carver. "Because of my wife," said Mr. Giddings. "If she knows you lived there and saw no reason to be afraid, perhaps she wouldn't be afraid to go back. Don't you see?" "Yes, I see," said Mrs. Carver. The farm is near Winton. You could drive out in less than a day," said Mr. Giddings. "All our things are in the house, chairs, tables, beds. You could move in tomorrow." We've never lived in the country," said Professor Carver. "We don't know how to run a farm." "There would be no work for you to do," said Mr. Giddings. "The handyman is there. He takes care of everything." "It must be cooler in the country," said Mrs. Carver. "Yes, indeed," said Mr. Giddings. "Windy Hill, we call it, because there's always a breeze." Professor Carver said to his wife, "You want to go, don't you?" "It's for you to say," she said. He asked Jamie and Lorna, "Do you want to go?" "It's for you to say," said Jamie. "It must be pretty there," said Lorna. Professor Carver said to Mr. Giddings, "I'd have to find someone to take my place at the school. Could you wait a week?" "Certainly," said Mr. Giddings. "And how long would you want us to stay?" asked Professor Carver. "Do you think you might stay a month?" asked Mr. Giddings. "That would be till the end of summer." Professor Carver looked at his wife. She nodded. And Lorna whispered to Jamie, We're going to Windy Hill." Chapter 3 is called Windy Hill. They left Boston early one morning in Mr. Giddings' carriage. Mr. Giddings came with them. He rode inside with the professor and Mrs. Carver. Jamie and Lorna rode outside on the driver's seat. "This is the best place," said Jamie. "We can see the country." They could talk with Riggs, the driver, too. He knew a story about every river they crossed and every town they passed. They came to Winton. Jamie and Lorna began to watch for Windy Hill. "You can't quite see it from here," said Riggs. "I'll tell you when." He took 2 pennies out of his pocket and held them in his hand. "I always like to have a little something for Bruno," he said. "Who is Bruno?" he asked. "You'll soon be seeing him," said Riggs. They came to the crossroads where bushes grew at the foot of a bank. A brown goat was tied to a bush. Nearby was a low cart with 4 wheels. Beside the cart sat a boy. His hair was black and curly. His head was down so that his face was almost hidden. He sat in an odd way, with his legs doubled under him. Riggs threw the pennies. They rolled in the dust by the road. The boy did not move. The carriage went by. Jamie and Lorna looked back. They saw the boy's hands dart out and pick up the pennies. "Now you've seen Bruno," said Riggs. Is he a beggar?" asked Lorna. There's not much else he can be, said Riggs. Bruno can't walk. Hasn't walked since he was little, they tell me. Every morning he gets into that goat cart and comes rattling down to the crossroads. People go by, and nearly everybody gives him something. Does he have a father and mother? Asked Lorna. He has a father, but no mother that I know of, said Riggs. They live off in the woods next to Windy Hill. See that stone fence? That's where Windy Hill begins. I see the house, said Jamie. It was a tall square house set high on the hill ahead. A great tree spread its branches above the roof. There's a tower, said Lorna. Old Jed Carey built the tower, said Riggs. He lived there 100 years ago. He kept thinking the Indians were coming to drive him out, so he put that tower on top of the house. Every day he'd go up there with his spyglass and keep watch. That went on for 20 years, but the Indians never came. They were climbing the hill. The road was steep and rough. Now Jamie and Lorna could see a small cottage near the big house. Who lives there? Asked Lorna. Stover, the handyman, said Riggs. It's a wonder he's not out here to meet us. They turned in at a driveway and stopped in front of the big house. Mr. Giddings was the first one out of the carriage. Welcome to Windy Hill, he said. It's beautiful, said Mrs. Carver. And wait till you see the rest. The woods and streams and fields, he said. What do you think, Professor? Will you be able to paint pictures here? I've seen 100 things to paint already, said Professor Carver. A man came out of the cottage. He was a small, bony-looking man, neither young nor old. Everything about him seemed faded, from his clothes to his hair to his pale blue eyes. Stover, this is Professor Carver, said Mr. Giddings. And this is his wife, and these are their children. They will be staying here for a while. Stover blinked his eyes. Staying, did you say, sir? Yes, said Mr. Giddings. Do what you can to make them comfortable. Their things are on top of the carriage. Help Riggs take them down. He unlocked the front door. The professor and Mrs. Carver followed him into the house. Jamie and Lorna walked behind them. They went down a hall and into a large parlor. Mr. Giddings raised the window shades. Sunlight shone in on the new chairs and tables, the rose-colored rug, and the grandfather clock. The kitchen and pantry are on the other side, he said. Here is a bedroom. You'll find more bedrooms upstairs. It's a lovely house, said Mrs. Carver. You'd never think it was haunted, would you? Said Mr. Giddings. I'm sure it isn't, she said. We'll see, said Mr. Giddings. We should know by the end of summer, shouldn't we? Windy Hill is not haunted. We can be sure of that already, said Professor Carver. If something mysterious happens here, it still won't mean there's a ghost in the house. A strange sound might be the wind. A strange sight might be someone playing a joke. If something mysterious does happen while you're here, will you help me find out what it really is? Asked Mr. Giddings. Of course, said the professor. Even if it means staying longer than a month? Asked Mr. Giddings. Yes, I'll help you, even if it means staying longer, said Professor Carver. Thank you, said Mr. Giddings. You've made me feel better. Within an hour, he told them, I must leave you now. My wife wants me back early, but I'll be stopping in again. He said goodbye. As the carriage drove away, they could see his face in the window. He looked as if he were sorry to go. Chapter 4 is called The Tower. Mrs. Carver had brought food from the city. They were having supper in the kitchen when the handyman came to the door. Begging your pardon, he said. There's milk and eggs in the spring house, and there's garden stuff when you want it. Corn and beans and onions. Thank you, Stover, said Professor Carver. Where's the spring house? Asked Mrs. Carver. Just down the walk there, said Stover. A spring house, said Mrs. Carver after the handyman had gone. We'll live like kings. What is a spring house? Asked Lorna. Oh, you city children, said Mrs. Carver. You don't know about such things, do you? Come, let's see what we find. They all went outside and down the walk. Behind the lilac bushes was a small stone house. Mrs. Carver opened the door. They could feel the coolness from inside. Water flowed across the stone floor about the pails and pans setting there. This little house was built over a spring, said Mrs. Carver. We can keep milk and butter and eggs here. The cool water keeps them fresh. And see what's there in the orchard, said Professor Carver. A beehive. Is there honey in it? Asked Lorna. We'll find out later, said the professor. We've had a full day, and I think we're all a little tired. Shall we get ready for bed? I want to choose my bedroom, said Jamie. I want to choose mine too, said Lorna. I've never had a room of my own. Why don't we all sleep in the same room tonight, said Mrs. Carver. By tomorrow we'll be used to the house, and you can look at the other rooms. They made beds in the big bedroom downstairs. Jamie made his bed on the floor by the window. He lay there and looked out into the night. He was almost asleep when something moved close beside him. He raised his head. At once he saw what had moved. A breeze had blown the curtain out from the window. He laughed to himself. But Mrs. Giddings would not have laughed, he thought. If she had seen the curtain move, she would have been sure a ghost was wandering through the house. In the morning, he and Lorna started upstairs. The steps were old and creaky. Every one makes a different sound, Lorna jumped up from step to step. You can almost play a tune on them. Jamie had gone ahead and was looking down the upstairs hallway. 6 doors, he said. That means 6 rooms up here. 6 rooms, said Lorna. In the city we only had only 2 together. When they went from one room to the other until they had seen them all. Which do you choose? Asked Lorna. The one at the head of the stairs, said Jamie. I like the fireplace. If it gets cool enough before the end of summer, I'll build a fire. Lorna chose the room just across the hall. Because of the 4-poster bed, she said. Let's go bring up our clothes, he said. Let's look at the attic first, said Lorna. I don't think there is an attic, he said. Then where does that go? She pointed to the narrow stairway halfway down the hall. It probably goes to the tower. Jamie climbed the steps. They led through an opening in the ceiling. He went up through the opening and into the tower. He felt his way past a tiny window that let in only a little light. He could feel dust in his nose and cobwebs across his face. At the top of the stairs was a square door. He pushed it open with his head. He stepped out onto the roof of the tower. Lorna was close behind him. They stood together and looked over the wooden railing. We're almost in the middle of the big elm tree, she said. We're like 2 birds in a nest. This tree couldn't have been here when old Jed Carey watched for Indians, said Jamie. He wouldn't have seen far with all these leaves and branches in the way. He put his hand to his eye as if he were looking through a spyglass. He said in a deep voice, I am the ghost of old Jed Carey. Do you see any Indians down there? Yes, they're all around us. Run for your life, said Lorna. She ran down out of the tower. He ran out after her. The door fell shut with a crash. They ran downstairs and through the parlor. Mrs. Carver came out of the kitchen. What on earth, she said. The Indians are coming, said Lorna. It's a game, said Jamie. He and Lorna ran out into the yard. They pretended to hide in the grass. They rested there in the wind and sun. "I like it here," said Lorna. "Don't you like it, Jamie?" "Yes, I do," he said. "Of all the places we've lived, this is the best." That is the end of our reading for tonight. We will begin again tomorrow night with chapter 5. Have a good evening.